The dust never settled on Samuel Crawford's ranch anymore. Where once cattle had grazed across rolling hills and horses had thundered through open fields, now only the wind moved through tall, yellowed grass. The wooden fence posts stood like silent sentinels, their gates chained shut with heavy iron links that had begun to rust in the harsh Montana weather. Samuel sat on his porch, the same spot he'd occupied every evening for the past 3 years, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of amber and crimson. His weathered hands gripped a cup of cold coffee, untouched since morning. At 62, his once broad shoulders had begun to curve inward, as if the weight of his solitude was physically pressing down upon him. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through his reverie. Samuel's gray eyes narrowed as he watched the small figure on horseback emerge from the tree line. Visitors were rare these days and unwelcome. He'd made that clear to everyone in Willowbrook, the nearest town 15 miles east. As the rider drew closer, Samuel could see it was just a boy, maybe 12 or 13 years old, sitting astride a tired-looking mare. The child's clothes were patched and worn, his dark hair tousled by the wind. When the boy reached the gate, he dismounted and approached on foot, leading his horse by the reins. Samuel remained seated, making no move to welcome the visitor. The boy stopped at the gate and looked up at him with large, dark eyes that seemed to hold more understanding than any child should. The kid raised his hand and made a series of quick, precise gestures. "I don't know what you're doing with your hands, boy," Samuel called out, his voice rough from disuse. "But whatever you're selling or asking for, I ain't interested. Gates are closed for a reason." The boy's expression didn't change. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, holding it up for Samuel to see. Then he pointed to Samuel, then to the paper, then made more of those strange hand movements. Something about the boy's persistence stirred an unwelcome feeling in Samuel's chest. He stood slowly, his joints protesting after hours of sitting. "You can't hear me, can you?" he said, more to himself than to the boy. The child watched Samuel's lips carefully, then nodded. He held up the paper again, this time pressing it against the gate's metal bars. Samuel descended the porch steps reluctantly. Each footfall seemed to echo across the empty yard, reminding him of how quiet his world had become. When he reached the gate, he could see the paper more clearly. It was folded carefully, and written on the outside in flowing script were the words, "For Samuel Crawford, from your daughter Emma." The coffee cup slipped from Samuel's fingers, shattering against the ground. His face went pale as he stared at the handwriting he recognized immediately, despite the years that had passed since he'd last seen it. "That's impossible," he whispered, his hands trembling as he reached through the bars to take the letter. "Emma's been dead for 3 years." The boy shook his head vigorously and pointed to the letter, then made more gestures that Samuel couldn't understand. The child's eyes were urgent, pleading. Samuel's hand shook as he unfolded the paper. The handwriting was definitely Emma's, and the words made his knees weak. "Pa, if you're reading this, then Thomas found you. I'm alive, and I need your help. I'm in Silver Creek, Colorado at the mission. Please come. I've been trying to reach you, but they told me you don't see anyone anymore. Thomas is deaf, but he's smart and brave. Trust him. I love you, Emma." Samuel read the letter 3 times before looking up at the boy, who was watching him intently. "Thomas?" Samuel's voice was barely a whisper. The boy nodded and pointed to himself, then made a gesture that Samuel somehow understood meant come or follow. "Emma's alive?" Samuel asked, though he knew the boy couldn't hear him. Thomas nodded again, this time with a small smile that transformed his serious face. Samuel looked back at his empty house, then at the chained gates that had kept the world out for so long. For the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than the crushing weight of grief. He felt hope, and it terrified him. Samuel spent the night staring at Emma's letter, reading it by lamplight until his eyes burned. Thomas had made camp just outside the gate, despite Samuel's half-hearted gestures for him to leave. When dawn broke over the mountains, Samuel found the boy tending to a small fire, cooking what looked like rabbit stew in a dented pot. The smell of food reminded Samuel that he'd barely eaten in days. He unlocked the gate for the first time in years, the screech of metal making him wince. Thomas looked up with those knowing eyes and offered Samuel a plate of stew without any expectation of payment or thanks. They ate in silence, Samuel, because he didn't know how to communicate with the boy, and Thomas because he couldn't hear Samuel's words anyway. But something passed between them in that shared meal, an understanding that surprised Samuel with its comfort. After breakfast, Thomas stood and began making gestures toward the horizon, pointing west toward Colorado. He pulled out a crude map drawn on the back of another piece of paper, showing the route to Silver Creek. Samuel studied it, calculating the distance and time it would take to travel. 3 days hard riding, Samuel said aloud, and caught himself. The boy was watching his lips, and Samuel wondered how much he understood. Thomas nodded and held up 3 fingers, confirming Samuel's estimate. Samuel looked back at his ranch, at the empty corrals, and the house that had become more tomb than home. The thought of leaving terrified him almost as much as the thought of staying. For 3 years he convinced himself that Emma was dead, killed in that stagecoach accident along with her husband. He'd attended the funeral, watched them lower 2 coffins into the ground, and built his grief into walls that nothing could penetrate. But here was this boy, this impossible messenger, carrying proof that everything Samuel had believed was wrong. Thomas seemed to sense his hesitation. The boy walked to his horse and began adjusting the saddle, making it clear he was ready to leave with or without Samuel. There was something in the child's determination that reminded Samuel of Emma at that age, the way she'd set her jaw when she'd made up her mind about something. "All right," Samuel said finally. "All right, we'll go. But I need to prepare." Samuel hadn't ridden any distance in 3 years. His horses were still in good condition, though they seemed as surprised as he was to be saddled again. He chose Dakota, a reliable bay gelding that had been Emma's favorite when she was younger. As he gathered supplies, Samuel found himself talking to Thomas, even though he knew the boy couldn't hear him. It felt good to have another person around, even a silent one. "Your horse needs grain," Samuel said, pointing to Thomas's mare. The boy nodded gratefully and helped Samuel tend to both animals. Thomas's hands were gentle but confident with the horses, showing he'd learned to care for them properly despite his young age. They set out just after noon, riding west toward the mountains. Samuel had forgotten how vast the landscape was, how it seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. For years his world had shrunk to the boundaries of his ranch, but now he remembered why he'd fallen in love with this country in the first place. Thomas rode slightly ahead, turning frequently to check on Samuel. The boy had an easy seat in the saddle and seemed comfortable with the long journey ahead. Samuel found himself wondering about Thomas's story, how he'd come to know Emma, and why she trusted him with such an important message. As the afternoon wore on, Samuel began to notice things about his young companion. Thomas paid attention to everything, constantly scanning the terrain, the sky, the behavior of their horses. His deafness seemed to have sharpened his other senses, making him more aware of their surroundings than most people Samuel had known. When they stopped to rest the horses at a creek crossing, Thomas suddenly grabbed Samuel's arm and pointed toward a ridge about a mile away. Samuel squinted but saw nothing unusual. Thomas made urgent gestures, pointing to his eyes, then to the ridge, then making a motion like something moving quickly. "Riders?" Samuel asked. Thomas nodded and held up 2 fingers. Samuel still couldn't see anything, but he trusted the boy's sharper eyes. They quickly watered the horses and moved on, taking a more concealed route through a valley. An hour later, Samuel finally spotted the 2 horsemen Thomas had seen, dark figures silhouetted against the sky. They seemed to be tracking someone, and Samuel had an uncomfortable feeling that someone might be them. That evening, they made a cold camp in a sheltered grove, not daring to light a fire. Thomas shared jerky and hardtack from his pack, and they drank water from their canteens. As darkness fell, Samuel watched the boys settle down for sleep with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to sleeping rough. Samuel lay awake, staring at the stars and thinking about Emma. If she was truly alive, why hadn't she come home herself? What was she doing in Silver Creek, and why did she need his help? The questions multiplied in his mind like stars appearing in the darkening sky. Beside him, Thomas slept peacefully, one hand resting on his horse's lead rope. Samuel realized that this deaf orphan boy had already done something Samuel hadn't thought possible. He'd made him care about something again. For that alone, Samuel owed him a debt he could never repay. The second day brought them into the foothills, where the air grew thinner and the trail more treacherous. Samuel's body ached from the unaccustomed riding, but Thomas never complained, though Samuel could see the boy was tired too. They'd been pushing hard since dawn, trying to make up time after their detour the previous day. Around midday, they came across a burned-out homestead, its blackened timbers reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers. Samuel pulled up short, his face grim. Thomas looked between Samuel and the ruins, then made questioning gestures. Comanche raids ended years ago, Samuel said, more to himself than to Thomas. This is something else. They dismounted to examine the site more closely. The destruction was recent, maybe a few weeks old. Samuel found tracks around the ruins, boot prints and horse hooves, but nothing that told him who was responsible or why. Thomas tugged on Samuel's sleeve and pointed to something partially buried in the ash. Samuel knelt and carefully brushed away the debris, revealing the child's wooden doll, its painted face melted but still recognizable. The sight hit him like a physical blow, reminding him of the doll Emma had carried everywhere when she was small. Thomas seemed to understand Samuel's distress. The boy gently took the doll and made a series of gestures that somehow conveyed sympathy and shared sorrow. Samuel realized that Thomas had probably seen more than his share of loss in his young life. They rode on in thoughtful silence, both affected by the grim discovery. The trail wound higher into the mountains, and Samuel began to recognize landmarks from his younger days when he'd driven cattle through these passes. The memories brought both comfort and pain, reminding him of times when Emma had ridden beside him, chattering about everything and nothing. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Thomas suddenly pulled up and dismounted, pressing his ear to the ground. Samuel watched, fascinated, as the boy listened intently to vibrations Samuel couldn't feel. After a moment, Thomas jumped up and made urgent gestures toward a stand of trees. "Horses?" Samuel guessed. Thomas nodded and held up several fingers, indicating a large group. Samuel's stomach tightened. The two riders from yesterday had apparently found reinforcements. They quickly led their horses into the cover of the trees and waited. Soon Samuel could hear what Thomas had already detected through the ground, the sound of multiple horses approaching at a steady pace. A group of 6 men rode past on the main trail, hard-looking characters with guns prominently displayed. Samuel recognized the type from his younger days when lawlessness was more common in these parts. What troubled him was seeing such men here now and in such numbers. One of the riders looked familiar, though Samuel couldn't place him immediately. The man had a scar across his left cheek and rode with the easy confidence of someone used to violence. When the group had passed, Samuel and Thomas waited another 20 minutes before emerging from their hiding place. Thomas pulled out his map again and pointed to a route that would take them around the main trail, adding miles but avoiding further encounters with the dangerous-looking riders. Samuel nodded agreement, impressed again by the boy's practical wisdom. As they rode through increasingly rugged terrain, Samuel found himself thinking about the men they'd seen. Something about their presence in this area, combined with the burned homestead, suggested trouble of a serious nature. If Emma was in Silver Creek, she might be in more danger than her letter had indicated. That evening they made camp in a natural shelter formed by overhanging rocks. Thomas again insisted on a cold camp, and Samuel was beginning to appreciate the boy's caution. As they shared their meager rations, Samuel tried to communicate more directly with Thomas. He pointed to himself and said "Samuel," then pointed to Thomas questioningly. The boy understood and pointed to himself, then carefully shaped his mouth to say "Thomas," though no sound came out. Samuel tried some simple gestures, copying movements he'd seen Thomas make. The boy's face lit up with surprise and pleasure when Samuel successfully signed "Thank you," a phrase Thomas had patiently repeated several times. Encouraged, Thomas began teaching Samuel other basic signs: water, horse, danger, good, bad. Samuel found himself enjoying the challenge, and it felt good to learn something new after years of mental stagnation. As the lesson continued, Thomas suddenly became more animated. He began telling Samuel a story through gestures, his hands moving expressively as he painted pictures in the air. Samuel could only catch fragments of the narrative, but he understood enough to realize Thomas was telling him about Emma. The boy showed how he'd met her at the mission in Silver Creek, how she'd been sick but was getting better. He demonstrated her kindness to him and the other children there, and how she'd worried about her father back in Montana. Thomas's face glowed with affection as he described Emma, and Samuel felt his heart clench with both gratitude and guilt. Through patient repetition and creative gesturing, Thomas managed to convey that Emma had been injured in the stagecoach accident but had survived. She'd been taken to the mission by travelers who'd found her wandering, confused and hurt. She'd lost her memory for a long time, but when it finally returned, her first thought had been of her father. Samuel's eyes filled with tears as he understood the magnitude of what had happened. For 3 years, he'd been mourning a daughter who was alive, while she'd been recovering from injuries and trying to remember who she was. The waste of it, the unnecessary pain they both endured, overwhelmed him. Thomas reached over and gently touched Samuel's shoulder, offering comfort with the same instinctive kindness Emma had always shown to those in need. In that moment, Samuel understood why his daughter had trusted this remarkable boy with the most important message of both their lives. "Tomorrow," Samuel said, making the sign Thomas had taught him for tomorrow. "Tomorrow we find Emma." Thomas smiled and nodded, and for the first time in 3 years, Samuel felt something approaching peace. The third day dawned clear and cold, with frost covering their blankets and ice forming at the edges of the stream where they'd watered their horses. Samuel's breath came in white puffs as he saddled Dakota, his fingers stiff with cold and anticipation. Silver Creek was only a few hours away, according to Thomas's map. As they rode through the final pass, the valley opened before them like a promise. Silver Creek nestled in a valley floor, a modest town built around the whitewashed church and a collection of simple buildings. Samuel could see the mission Thomas had told him about, distinguished by its bell tower and the small cross that caught the morning sunlight. Thomas urged his horse faster, and Samuel could see the boy's excitement building. After 3 days of careful travel and constant vigilance, they were finally approaching their destination. But as they drew closer to the town, Samuel noticed something was wrong. Smoke rose from several buildings, and there were too many horses tied up outside the saloon for this early in the morning. The dangerous-looking riders they'd avoided on the trail were here in Silver Creek. Thomas saw it too, his expression growing worried. He pointed toward the mission and made urgent gestures, clearly concerned for Emma's safety. Samuel felt his own anxiety spike as he realized his daughter might be caught in the middle of whatever trouble had come to this peaceful valley. They approached the town cautiously, staying to the back streets and avoiding the main thoroughfare where the strangers' horses were gathered. Samuel could hear raised voices coming from the direction of the church, and his jaw tightened with determination. The mission was a simple adobe structure surrounded by a garden where vegetables grew in neat rows. Thomas led Samuel to a back entrance, moving with the confidence of someone familiar with the layout. He knocked on the wooden door in a specific pattern, obviously a prearranged signal. The door opened to reveal a middle-aged woman in a nun's habit, her face creased with worry. When she saw Thomas, her expression brightened with relief. She said something Samuel couldn't hear, and Thomas responded with rapid sign language. The nun looked at Samuel with surprise and hope. "You're Emma's father?" she asked in accented English. "She has spoken of you so often. I am Sister Maria." Sister Maria's expression grew troubled. "She is here, but she is frightened. Men came to the town yesterday, asking questions about the people at the mission. They seem to be looking for someone, and Emma fears they might be looking for her." Thomas made urgent gestures, and Sister Maria nodded. "Thomas says you saw these men on the trail. Emma was right to be worried." "I need to see her," Samuel said simply. Sister Maria led them to a corridor lined with simple wooden doors. She stopped at one and knocked gently. "Emma, your father is here." Samuel heard footsteps, then the door opened slowly. The woman who stood there was undeniably his daughter, though 3 years in hardship had changed her. She was thinner than he remembered, with lines around her eyes that spoke of suffering endured. But when she saw Samuel, her face lit up with the same joy he remembered from her childhood. "Pa?" she whispered, as if afraid he might disappear. Samuel swept her into his arms, holding her as if he could make up for 3 years of separation in a single embrace. Emma wept against his chest, and Samuel felt his own tears falling freely for the first time since he thought he'd lost her. "I'm sorry," Emma sobbed. "I'm so sorry I couldn't come home. I tried to send word, but they told." "Me, you wouldn't see anyone. I didn't know what else to do." "Hush now," Samuel murmured, stroking her hair. "None of that matters. You're alive, and that's all that counts." Thomas stood nearby, watching the reunion with satisfaction. Sister Maria rested a gentle hand on his shoulder, and Samuel realized that this boy had not only delivered Emma's message, but had probably saved both their lives by bringing them together. "We need to leave," Emma said urgently, pulling back to look at her father. "The men who've come to town, they're not just asking questions. They're working for someone who wants to control the mission's land. There's silver been found in the hills, and they're trying to force everyone out." Samuel's expression hardened. "They threaten you?" Not directly, but Sister Maria says they've made it clear that anyone who doesn't cooperate will face consequences. I'm scared, Pa. I don't want to bring trouble to the people who saved me. Samuel looked at Thomas, who was watching their conversation intently. The boy had already shown more courage and wisdom than most adults Samuel knew. An idea began to form in his mind. "Pack what you need," Samuel told Emma. "We're going home." "But the men outside, let me worry about them," Samuel said with quiet confidence. "Thomas, can you get us out of town without being seen?" Thomas nodded confidently and began making gestures, outlining a plan. Sister Maria translated, explaining that Thomas knew a way through the hills that would bypass the main roads entirely. An hour later, 3 riders quietly left Silver Creek by a back trail, leading a pack horse carrying Emma's few possessions and supplies donated by the grateful mission. Samuel rode protectively beside his daughter, while Thomas scouted ahead with the same careful attention that had kept him safe on the journey. As they climbed into the hills above the valley, Emma told her father about the years she'd lost and found. The accident had left her with serious injuries and no memory of who she was. The mission had cared for her as she slowly healed, both physically and mentally. When her memory finally returned, her first clear thought had been of her father, alone and grieving on his ranch. "I heard in town that you'd close yourself off from everyone," Emma said sadly. "I was afraid you wouldn't want to see me after all this time." Samuel reached over and took her hand. "I thought I'd lost you forever. I stopped living because I thought there was nothing left to live for. But you and Thomas, you've given me back something I thought was gone." Thomas, riding ahead, turned to flash them one of his rare smiles. In 3 days, this remarkable boy had accomplished what no one else had been able to do. He brought Samuel Crawford back to the world of the living. As they rode toward home, Samuel made a silent promise. His gates would never be closed again. Not to Thomas, who would always have a place at their table. Not to anyone who needed help or shelter. Emma's return had taught him that life was too precious to waste on grief, and too short to spend in isolation. The ranch that awaited him might be empty now, but it wouldn't stay that way. There was work to be done, life to be lived, and love to be shared. And it had all started with a deaf orphan boy who'd refused to let a closed gate keep him from delivering the most important message of 3 people's lives.